The Magician's Horse. Once upon a time there was a king who had 3 sons. Now it happened that one day the 3 princes went out hunting in a large forest at some distance from their father's palace, and the youngest prince lost his way, so his brothers had to return home without him. For 4 days the prince wandered through the glades of the forest, sleeping on moss beneath the stars at night, and by day living on roots and wild berries. At last, on the morning of the 5th day, he came to a large open space in the middle of the forest, and here stood a stately palace, but neither within nor without was there any trace of human life. The prince entered the open door and wandered through the deserted rooms without seeing a living soul. At last he came on a great hall, and in the center of the hall was a table spread with dainty dishes and choice wines. The prince sat down and satisfied his hunger and thirst, and immediately afterwards the table disappeared from his sight. This struck the prince as strange, but though he continued his search through all the rooms, upstairs and down, he could find no one to speak to. At last, just as it was beginning to get dark, he heard steps in the distance, and he saw an old man coming towards him up the stairs.
"What are you doing wandering about my castle?" asked the old man.
To whom the prince replied, "I lost my way hunting in the forest. If you will take me into your service, I should like to stay with you, and will serve you faithfully."
"Very well," said the old man. "You may enter my service. You will have to keep the stove always lit. You will have to fetch the wood for it from the forest, and you will have changed the black horse in the stables. I will pay you a florin a day, and at meal times you will always find the table in the hall spread with food and wine, and all you can eat is..."
The prince was satisfied, and he entered the old man's service, and promised to see that there was always wood on the stove, so that the fire should never die out. Now, though he did not know it, his new master was a magician, and the flame on the stove was a magic fire, and if it had gone out, the magician would have lost a great part of his power. One day the prince forgot, and let the fire burn so low that it was nearly burnt out, and just as the flame was flickering, the old man stormed into the room.
"What do you mean, letting the fire burn so low?" he growled. "I've only arrived just in the nick of time."
While the prince hastily threw a log on the stove and blew on the ashes to kindle the glow, his master gave him a severe box on the ear and warned him that if it ever happened again,
it would fare badly for you.
One day the prince was sitting disconsolate in the stables when, to his surprise, the black horse spoke to him. "Come to my stall," he said. "I have something to say to you. Fetch my bridle and saddle from the cupboard and put them on me. Take the bottle that is beside them. It contains an ointment which will make your hair shine like pure gold. And then put all the wood you can gather together in the fire until it is piled up quite high." So the prince did what the horse told him, and saddled and bridled the horse, and put the ointment on his hair until it shone like gold. And it made such a big fire in the stove that the flames sprang up and set fire to the roof, and in a few minutes the palace was burning like a huge bonfire. Then he hurried back to the stables, and the horse said to him, "There is one thing more you must do. In the cupboard you will find a looking-glass, a brush, and a riding whip. Bring them with you and mount my back, and ride as hard as you can, for now the house is burning merrily." The prince did as the horse bade him, and scarcely had he got into the saddle than the horse was off and away, galloping at such a pace that, in a short time, the forest and all the country belonging to the magician lay far behind them. In the meantime, the magician returned to his palace, which he found in smoldering ruins. In vain he called for his servant. At last he went to look for him in the stables, and when he discovered that the black horse had disappeared too, he at once suspected that they had gone together. So he mounted a roan horse that was in the next stall and set out on pursuit. As the prince rode, the quick ears of the horse heard the sound of pursuing feet. "Look behind you," he said, "and see if the old man is following." And the prince turned in his saddle and saw a cloud of smoke or dust in the distance. "We must hurry," said the horse. After they had galloped for some time, the horse said again, "Look behind and see if you can still see at some distance." "Oh, he is quite close," answered the prince. "Then throw the looking-glass on the ground," said the horse. So the prince threw it, and when the magician came up, the roan horse stepped on the mirror, and crash! His foot went through the glass, and he stumbled and fell, cutting his feet so badly that there was nothing the old man could do except slowly go back with him to the stables and put new shoes on his feet. And then they started once more in pursuit of the prince, for the magician set great value on the horse and was determined not to lose it. In the meantime, the prince had gone a great distance, but the quick ears of the black horse detected the sound of following feet from afar. "Dismount," said the prince. "Put your ear to the ground and tell me if you do not hear a sound." So the prince dismounted and listened. "I seem to hear the earth tremble," he said. "I think he cannot be very far off." "Not me at once," answered the horse, "and I will gallop as fast as I can." And he set off so fast that the earth seemed to fly from under his hooves. "Look back once more," he said after a short time, "and see if he is in sight." "I see a cloud and a flame," answered the prince, "but a long way off." "We must make haste," said the horse, and shortly after he said, "Look back again. He can't be far off now." The prince turned in his saddle and exclaimed, "He is close behind us. In a minute the flame of his horse's nostrils will reach us." "Then throw the brush on the ground," said the horse. And the prince threw it, and in an instant the brush was changed into a thick wood that even a bird could not have gotten through. And when the old man got up on the roan horse, suddenly came to a standstill, not able to advance, but only had to retrace his steps and fetch an axe to cut his way through the woods. But it took some time, during which the prince and the black horse got on well ahead. But once more they heard the sound of pursuing feet. "Look back," said the black horse, "and see if he's following." "Yes," answered the prince. This time I hear him distinctly." "Let us hurry on," said the horse. And a little later he said, "Look back now, and see if he is in sight." "Yes," said the prince, turning red. "I see the flame. He's close behind us." "Then you must throw down the whip," answered the horse. In the twinkling of an eye, the whip changed to a broad river. When the old man got up on it, he urged the roan horse into the water. But as the water mounted higher and higher, the magic flame which gave the magician all his power grew smaller and smaller, till with a fizz it went out, and the old man and the roan horse sank into the river and disappeared. The prince looked round, and they were no longer to be seen. "Now," said the horse, "you may dismount. There is nothing more to fear, for the magician is dead. Beside that brook you will find a willow wand. Gather it and strike the earth with it, and it will open for you, and you will see a door at your feet." When the prince had struck the earth with the wand, a door appeared and opened into a large vaulted stone hall. "Lead me into the hall," said the horse. "I will stay there, but you must go through the fields till you reach a garden, in the midst of which a king's palace. When you get there, you must ask to be taken into the king's service. Goodbye. Don't forget me." So they parted. But first the horse made the prince promise not to let anyone in the palace see his golden hair. So he bound a scarf around it like a turban, and the prince set off through the fields, till he reached a beautiful garden, and beyond the garden he saw walls and towers of a stately palace. At the golden gate he met a gardener, who asked him what he wanted. "I want to take service with the king," replied the prince. "Well, you may stay and work under the garden," said the man, for the prince was dressed like a poor man, and he could not tell that he was a king's son. "I need someone to weed the ground and sweep the dead leaves from the paths. You shall have a 400 a day, a horse to help you with the cart the leaves away, and good food and drink." So the prince consented and set about his work. But when his food was given to him, he only ate half of it. The rest he carried to the vaulted hall beside the brook, and gave to the black horse. And this he did every day, and the horse thanked him for his faithful friendship. One evening, as they were together after his work in the garden was over, the horse said to him, "Tomorrow a large company of princes and great lords are coming to your king's palace. They have been coming from far and near as wooers to the 3 princesses. They will stand in a row in the courtyard of the palace, and all 3 princesses will come out, and each will carry a diamond apple in her hand, which she will throw into the air. Whoever's feet the apple falls will be the bridegroom of that princess. You must be close in the garden in your work. The apple of the youngest princess, who will be the most beautiful of the sisters, will roll past the wooers and stop before you. Pick it up at once and put it into your pocket." The next day, when the wooers were all assembled in the courtyard of the castle, everything happened just as the horse had said. The princesses threw their apples into the air, and the diamond apple of the youngest princess rolled past the wooers, out into the garden, and stopped at the feet of the young gardener, who was busy sweeping the leaves away. In a moment he had stooped down and picked up the apple and put it in his pocket. As he stooped, the scarf from his head fell to one side a little, and the princess caught sight of his hair and loved him. But the king was very sad, for his youngest daughter was the one he loved best. But there was no help for it, and the next day the threefold wedding was celebrated at the palace. And after the wedding, the youngest princess returned with her husband to the small hut in the garden where he lived. Some time after this, the people of a neighboring country went to war with the king, and he set out to battle, accompanied by the husbands of his 2 eldest daughters, mounted on stately steeds. But the husband of the youngest daughter had nothing but the old, broken-down horse which helped him in the garden work, and the king, who was ashamed of his son-in-law, refused to give him any other. So he was determined not to be left behind. He went into the garden and mounted the sorry nag, and set out. But scarcely had he ridden a few yards before the horse stumbled and fell. So he dismounted and went down to the brook where the black horse lived in his vaulted hall. The horse said to him, "Saddle and bridle me, and then we'll go to the next room, and you'll find a suit of armor and a sword. Put them on, and we will ride forth together into battle." And the prince did as he was told, and when he had mounted the horse, his armor glittered in the sun, and he looked so brave and handsome that no one would have recognized him as the gardener who swept away all the dead leaves from the path. The horse bore him away at a great pace, and when they reached the battlefield, they saw that the king was losing the day. So many of his warriors had been slain. But when the warrior on his black charger in the glittering armor appeared on the scene, hewing right and left with the sword, the enemy were dismayed and fled in all directions, leaving the king master of the field. When the king and his 2 son-in-laws, when they saw their deliverer, shouted, and they left the field of an army, joined in the cry, "God has come to our rescue!" And they would have surrounded him, but his black horse rose in the air and bore him out of their sight. Soon after this, part of the country rose in a rebellion against the king, and once more he and his 2 sons-in-law had to fare forth in battle. The son-in-law who was disguised as a gardener wanted to fight too, so he came to the king and said, Dear father, let me ride with you into the battle and your enemies.
I don't want a blockhead like you to fight for me, answered the king. Besides, I haven't got a horse fit for you. But see, there's a carter on the carting hay. You may take his horse.
So the prince took the carter's horse, but the poor beast was old and tired, and after it had gone a few yards it too stumbled and fell. So the prince returned sadly to the garden and watched the king ride forth at the head of his army, accompanied by his 2 son-in-laws. When they were out of sight, the prince betook himself to the vaulted chamber by the brookside, and having taken counsel with the faithful black horse, put on the glittering suit of armor, and was borne on the back of the horse through the air, to where the battle was being fought. And once more he routed the king's enemies, hacking to right and left with his sword. And again all cried, "A god has come to our rescue!" But when they tried to detain him, the black horse rose into the air and bore him out of their sight. When the king and his sons-in-laws returned home, they could talk of nothing but the hero who had fought for them, and all wondered who he could be. Shortly afterwards, the king of a neighboring country declared war, and once more the king and his son-in-laws went into battle. And once more the prince begged to ride with them, but the king said he had no horse to spare for him.
"But," he said, "you may take the horse of the woodsman who brings the wood from the forest. It is good enough for you."
So the prince took the woodsman's horse, but it was old and useless, and could not carry him beyond the castle gates. So he betook himself once more to the vaulted hall, where the black horse was preparing and waiting for him, and a suit of armor, more than the one he had worn on the previous occasions. And when he had put it on and mounted the back of the horse, he bore him straight to the battlefield, and once more he scattered the king's enemies, fighting single-handed in the ranks, and they fled in all directions. But it happened that one of the enemies struck with his sword and wounded the prince on the leg. And the king took his own pocket handkerchief with his name and crown embroidered on it, and bound it round the wounded leg. And the king would have fain compelled him to mount in a litter and be carried straight to the palace, and his 2 knights were to lead the black horse back to the stables. But the prince put his hand on the mane of his faithful horse and managed to pull himself up into the saddle, and the horse mounted into the air with him. Then they all shouted, "The warrior who has fought for us is a god! He must be a god!" And throughout the kingdom nothing else was spoken about, for all the people said, "Who can be the hero who has fought for us in so many battles? He cannot be a man, he must be a god!" And the king said, "If only I could see him once more, and if it turned out that he was a man and not a god, I would reward him with half my kingdom." Now, when the prince reached his home, the gardener's hut where he had lived with his wife, he was weary and lay down on his bed and slept. And his wife noticed the handkerchief bound around his wounded leg, and she wondered what it could be. Then she looked at it more closely and saw it was the corner that was her father's name and royal crown embroidered on. So she ran straight to the palace and told her father, and he and his 2 son-in-laws followed her back to her house. And there lay the gardener asleep in his bed, and the scarf that he always wore bound around his head had slipped off, and his golden hair gleamed on the pillow. And they all recognized that this was the hero who had fought and won so many battles for them. There was a great rejoicing throughout the land. The king rewarded his son-in-law with half the kingdom, and he and his wife reigned happily over it.